and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, emerging market stocks faltered today as we saw investors dumping emerging market assets. News that there's a spike in new coronavirus cases in South Korea spurred fears that the pathogen is more contagious than initially thought. Now, South Africa's JSE did climb this morning but stagnated by the close of the trading day. News that China's central bank had cut its lending rate did help market sentiment. But of course, mixed Asian markets have been a drag on the market as Tencent, which of course influences the JSE via major shareholder Naspers, had fallen 0.81% on the day. Now, also coming up on today's show, Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo promises an improved economy ahead of elections later this year. The European Union is looking to make its mark in the tech and artificial intelligence sectors. And we'll tell you why Sudan bakeries are heavily guarded in Khartoum. Well, let's kick off tonight's show in Ghana, where President Nana Akufo-Addo has delivered his last State of the Nation address ahead of general elections in December. Now, during his speech, Akufo-Addo attributed the boost in Ghana's economy over the last 3 years to the banking sector and financial reforms. The president is promising a better economy if he's retained in power for the next 4 years. He also says he's working to resolve Nigeria's land border closure, which of course has hit many businesses in Ghana. In the meantime, Akufo-Addo's 2020 State of the Nation address saw opposition lawmakers walking out of parliament. The MPs were protesting his style of governance amid accusations he has eroded the country's democracy.
Our economic growth has rebounded to place Ghana among the fastest growing economies in the world for 3 years in a row, at an annual average of 7% GDP growth, up from 3.4% in 2016, the lowest in nearly 3 decades. The international investor community has recognized this development, resulting in Ghana today being the largest recipient of foreign direct investment in West Africa. The sovereign credit ratings agencies have upgraded our ratings and also improved the outlook for this year, notwithstanding the fact that it is an election year. This is a massive vote of confidence in the current management of the economy.
Well, let's get the details on today's State of the Nation address. We're joined by Nabil Ahmed Rufai. He joins us now in Accra. Nabil, great to have you on the show. Now, of course, Akufo-Addo has been quite strong on the economy. Oil output is up. Inflation has slowed in the country. And of course, the CD is one of the best performing currencies amongst emerging markets. But still, some in Ghana feel that growth hasn't translated into better living conditions for most Ghanaians. So what are some of the key issues on the table and how did he address them in his address today?
Uche, one of the key issues that have been bothering a lot of businessmen here in Ghana has to do with the closure of the land border between Nigeria and Benin. And this the president indeed mentioned in his delivery during the State of the Nation address. He says he's also equally concerned about the land border closure, and businesses have lost millions of dollars as their goods remain stranded at the border and they are not able to do business between Ghana and Nigeria as a result of the land border closure. He actually said one of the things he's doing to really resolve the situation is by being in talks with authorities within the ECOWAS economic communities of West African states to see how best they can resolve this situation as soon as possible. We know Nigeria closed its border over 5 months ago, and businesses here in Ghana are really being affected by this. Another issue that was key during his delivery of the State of the Nation address has to do with illegal mining, which has been on the front burner in discussions here in Ghana within the past few weeks. A lot of water bodies have been destroyed as a result of illegal mining in some parts of the country. Also, the environment has been destroyed. Those engaged in the illegal mining have not done anything in terms of reclamation of their land. And although the government has been fighting illegal mining since it came into power in 2016, it appeared that the fight against this illegal mining has not really been successful. And the government actually, when the president made his presentation, said this has come to his attention and he wants to assure the nation that he's indeed still going to fight illegal mining in the country in order to protect the environment and also water bodies, which people who are even farming in those areas are not able to farm as a result of the pollution caused by the illegal mining. And lastly, one other thing that he also mentioned, which was key to his delivery, was the fact that the coronavirus outbreak in China, this week we saw some parents of students studying in China, especially in Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus, calling on the president to evacuate their children from Wuhan. The president says indeed he sympathizes with the parents of the children who are studying in China. We know a lot of students from Ghana are studying in China through scholarships, and for now, evacuating them is not an option the government is considering because it's going through a strict protocol by the World Health Organization, which says there shouldn't be any evacuation for now. But then the government says it would really consider this if it should become very, very necessary. So these are the three key things that came to the fore when the president made his presentation in Parliament: issue about the Nigeria border closure, one about the coronavirus, and also the illegal mining going on in the country. Uche.
Well, Nabil, with regards to the country's economy, we know Ghana's debt position has deteriorated under Akufo-Addo. Debt now stands at about 63% of GDP as at the end of 2019. That's compared to 59% in January 2019. So what's his plan to address Ghana's debt position?
Well, Uche, the government has always argued that the debt that it has accrued over the period is for a good cause, is towards improving the economy. So the citizens should not be worried about the accumulated debt it has gotten so far. But then it's also made mention that the government has put in place what it calls a debt management strategy to really tackle its debt, and one of the key things is going to take these long-term bonds, and it's evident with the €3 billion bond that the government has been able to secure. This bond will also help the government service its part of its debt. Also, another thing that the government is looking at doing to reducing its debt is by diversifying investor base and engaging local investors to take up part of the financial sector in order to strengthen economic growth in the country. So the government indeed agrees that the debt has ballooned since it came to power, but it says it's working to really reduce it.
Now, one of Akufo-Addo's wins in the past 3 years was the cleanup of the country's banking sector. That costs the government about $3 billion. Now, how does he plan to approach the issue of depositors' funds, which are still locked up with some financial institutions in the country?
Indeed, Uche, the president made mention about this $3 billion that has really gone into the financial cleanup. He made mention that about another $1 billion is going to be used to pay these depositors whose money got locked up during the cleanup exercise. But he also said those who were responsible for the situation by the collapse of the banks, managers of these banks, are going to face the law. Some of them are being sent to court, and some of their assets will be retrieved to be used in making these payments to the depositors. So the government says it's really working to really resolve this situation by the time it ends its tenure in December, and has assured the depositors that they are going to receive 100% of their money after going through a validation process successfully to be able to really get the fact that their money were locked up and then they deserve to be paid. So the government says it's actually doing all this to ensure that the country does not face such a situation in the future.
Well, as always, many thanks, Nabil, for your insights. That's Nabil Ahmed Rufai joining us there in Accra. Well, speaking of border closures, after Nigeria closed its land borders to trade last August, headline inflation in the country still continues to soar. The latest data indicates it rose to 12.13% in January, which is close to a two-year high. Now, Nigerian authorities say the border closures were meant to stop cross-border smuggling of goods, but it's also pushed prices in basic commodities, especially food, even higher. Well, CGTN's Deji Badmus explores the response from Nigeria's central bank.
When at its last meeting in January, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria increased the cash reserve ratio for deposit money banks for the first time in about 4 years, it was literally to check rising inflation in the country. But the latest inflation figure from the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics is a clear indication that measure has at least not yet had much of an effect.
The issue we have is not a monetary policy problem. Monetary policy solution cannot deal with the issue of inflation. Because in spite of all of this, prices are still going up. So that means that we should be looking more at the fiscal policy side.
The current rate of 12.13% is the highest in 21 months and the fifth rise in 5 consecutive months. Many have blamed Nigeria's border closure, which has lasted for several months now, for the spike in inflation. But some analysts say there are many more other causes, especially in the country's agriculture sector.
Productivity in the agricultural sector is very low because most of those who are operators in the sector are still operating at a very small scale. Many of them are smallholder farmers. They have limited application of technology. They don't have quality seedlings. So all of these things are affecting productivity in the sector, therefore affecting supply and therefore affecting prices. There's also this factor of security. Many of the farming communities have been affected by the security problems that we have. And these are the people that produce the food that we eat domestically.
The biggest worry for many is that the current spike in inflation is mainly driven by higher food prices, something that directly affects the ordinary citizen on the street. The question now is, for how long will the inflation level increase before it begins to beat a retreat?
The inflation that we have is essentially cost-driven. It's what you call cost-push inflation. For as long as we are not able to address some of these key drivers, particularly the element of cost, for so long will these prices will continue to be high.
With global oil prices trending close to Nigeria's budget benchmark price of $57 per barrel, the country might be thrown into a currency crisis that could further exacerbate the inflation situation and bring Nigeria's economy under much more severe pressure. It's indeed a very tough time for managers of Africa's biggest economy. Deji Badmus, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
And let's stay in Nigeria. The government will review the sale of power assets to private investors, given the failure so far to end chronic supply shortages in the country. Now, the review proposal has been submitted to the cabinet. Nigeria vies with South Africa as Africa's largest economy, but despite having over 200 trillion cubic feet of proven natural gas reserves, grid electricity is still notoriously unreliable. 7 years ago, some utilities were privatized in order to attract fresh capital and expertise into generation and distribution segments. Even though the country has roughly 13,000 megawatts of generation capacity, only about 3,000 megawatts of it is functional on any given day. Now, to date, at least 20 million households still do not have access to electricity from the national grid. Those who are connected are often plagued with regular outages. Well, let's take this apart further with Eric Olubenga. He's the former secretary of the National Union of Electricity Employees. Great to have you on the show with us, Mr. Olubenga. Now, almost a decade ago, we saw the privatization of Nigeria's power sector. Why have the private sector investors in the power sector struggled and suddenly failed to improve power supply in the country?
Yeah, the reason why it is so is that those people that organize the investors that are monitoring, or the disco rider now, are not prepared for the business. Power business is not meant for businessmen or businesswomen. They don't have the willpower, they don't have the financial backing to invest in the network. That is the reason why they could not move between 4,500 megawatts that was there before the takeover. That's why they can't move beyond that, because the network is still strangulated, that cannot carry more load. They've not expanded the network. They've not invested in the network. Therefore, that's the reason that they still move around within the 4,500 megawatts. And for now, they're not picking 4,500 megawatts. They're picking lower than 4,000, 5,000 megawatts.
But what exactly does this review of the privatization effort hope to achieve? Especially, will we see these new investors or even the government able to take on and overcome those challenges and setbacks that current investors are facing in the power sector?
Yeah, actually, what the intention to the review of the review wanted to achieve is for the government to actually give a legal framework that will make the industry perform. If the new investors are coming in, those people that have the willpower, those people that have the technicality, those people that have the money, that to come into Nigeria, to come and invest in the power sector and actually give power to average Nigeria. Power business is not meant for businessmen. It's an investment, a long investment that will later yield result to investors, and even though to Nigerians who will benefit from it. Do you realize that for now, that most of the consumers in Nigeria, we have 30%, less than 30% have meter. Therefore, the government is coming to give out a legal framework that will enable Nigeria enjoy power supply. The investor that is coming will actually reap their investment in the later day.
Well, we do have to leave it there, Mr. Olubenga. Thank you so much for your insights. That was Eric Olubenga. He's the former secretary of the National Union of Electricity Employees. Well, let's shift focus now and take a look at tonight's company headlines, starting with commodities. Anglo-American says its full-year profits rose by 9% as higher prices for iron ore and precious metals outweighed weakness in diamonds and coal. Now, Anglo's underlying earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization rose to $10 billion in the year to December, up from about $9.16 billion a year earlier. And Kenya's largest telecoms operator, Safaricom, will consider awarding a contract to China's Huawei as it rolls out its commercial 5G network in 2020. The U.S. government has been urging a broad range of countries not to use Huawei, arguing that doing so will compromise data security. Now, according to some analysts, involving Huawei in Safaricom's 5G network could hamper talks on a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Kenya. The start of negotiations were announced earlier this month. And South African department chain Woolworths reported a 17.7% drop in half-year earnings, dragged down by disappointing women's wear and Black Friday sales. The firm's headline earnings per share, the main profit measure in South Africa, declined to 164.9 cents in the 26 weeks ending December 29th. The decline in profit was compounded by an accounting change. Excluding the impact of the accounting change, HEPS fell about 10.1%. And finally, airlines are warning of a severe financial impact as the coronavirus dampens demand for travel in Asia. Australia's Qantas says the outbreak will cost it $99 million, while Air France KLM estimated a hit of up to $216 million. Air France is extending a ban on Chinese flights until at least the end of March, while Qantas will cut flights to Asia by 15% until the end of May. And that is a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let us take a short break now. Still to come. The African Development Bank calls on business leaders to embrace the digital economy. And we'll bring you the highlights from Tunisia's International Human Resources Expo.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues for taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back. Now, the United States says it will provide financial assistance to Ethiopia as it pursues far-reaching political reforms. During his visit to the country, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo praised political reforms which Abe has spearheaded ahead of Ethiopia's elections at the end of August. Well, let's delve further into US-Ethiopia relations going forward. We're joined in Addis Ababa by Zemedene Negatu. He is the global chairman of the Fairfax Africa Fund. Great to have you on the show with us, Mr. Negatu. Now, this visit between Ethiopia and US, of course, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, it was meant to shape, in quotes, new ties between the two countries and, of course, reveal additional financial support from the US. How did you see this visit opening new doors in the country's relations?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back on your show. As you've indicated, Secretary Pompeo was here. In fact, he just left yesterday after the 3-day trip. Ethiopia and the United States have had a very long relationship over 100 years. But I think his visit is trying to recast it in a broader sense, meaning that if you look at the US-Ethiopia relationship over the last 20 years, 25 years, it was primarily predicated on security relationships and perhaps aid. What the U.S. is now trying to do, at least the way we understand it, is because of Ethiopia's massive reforms and multiple platforms, on the political platform as well as the economic platform, and the overall role Ethiopia, led by Prime Minister Abiy, has taken in the region, it looks like Washington has decided that they want to engage Ethiopia on a broader sphere, in particular on the economic front. And this has been demonstrated by, for example, the financing Ethiopia got about a month and a half ago, a $9 billion financing from the IMF, the World Bank, and the European partners primarily, combined $9 billion, with a lot more to come. So I think our view is that Pompeo was here to reinforce that. And as you said in your intro, also there's election coming up in Ethiopia, and they would like to support this a very successful process of the election. So, in other words, they're here to say we would like to engage Ethiopia broadly, and Ethiopia, as you probably know, is the second most populous country on the continent and now has the third largest GDP by many measures in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's becoming, even economically, a very meaningful, substantial material economy, and the U.S. sees opportunities. The U.S., as well as its European partners, sees opportunities for Americans and Europeans to benefit from the economic growth of Ethiopia, which by this year will still continue to be amongst the fastest in the world. So in a nutshell, I think that's what we think was the purpose of the visit. But there's a subtext here which I think I want to emphasize, which is the big elephant in the room was China. And I think if you see all the analysts, including us, we think the fact that China is heavily engaged in Ethiopia and has been providing significant financing and also been investing very significantly in Ethiopia, I'm sure caught Washington's attention. And I think they're also trying to show the Ethiopians there's an alternative to the Chinese way of doing business.
Right.
And that's what Secretary Pompeo was trying to convey. But I'm not so sure if that message is clearly accepted across Africa, not just in Ethiopia, because the U.S. has to provide some tangible things for Africans to be able to carry weight of what Pompeo and the administration in Washington is saying about China.
Right. Well, we are having some issues with your audio, Mr. Negatu. We'll be coming back to you shortly as we fix that, but do stay with us. We'll be coming back to you shortly. In the meantime, let's shift focus slightly. The African Development Bank recently held a workshop on digital economy and the fourth industrial revolution in Africa. Now, this follows a report which was published by the bank, which of course focused on how economies here can best prepare for the challenges posed by cheaper, widespread machine learning automation, as well as 3D printing and a range of privacy concerns. Here's CGTN's Brian Toussaint with the details.
The African Development Bank has hosted its member countries and other business leaders, both in the public and private sectors, in Abidjan. The delegates were discussing ways to harness the digital economy, as well as the fourth industrial revolution.
Africa is ready. Africa has what it takes to play a major role in the post-industrial revolution. We'll look at the challenges, we'll bring up solutions to those challenges. I know that skills and human capital development is very important. We need to build the skills. But you know, African youth are very, very energetic, they're very passionate, they're very smart. So we feel that we have all the ingredients for Africa to really play a major role in the post-industrial revolution. And this is why we're here today to really explore all of these opportunities and to say what can we do. And 2, 3, 5 years from now, you will see Africa really leading in the post-industrial revolution technologies.
The discussion centered around the use of emerging technologies for financial inclusion in Africa. Experts say the continent needs to invest in innovation, project financing, and youth training to enter the fourth industrial revolution.
The most promising fields in this fourth industrial revolution in Africa are telemedicine, e-government, and e-education. These three sectors are really important and will allow Africa to have a real synergy and do better than the Western world and Asia, quickly and at a lower cost.
The workshop was also an opportunity for African startups to exhibit their products and services.
We have solutions in the area of health, such as the Shen prosthesis and also the first bionic hand designed in Mali. In addition, we have solutions in the area of security, such as a mobile geophysio vest. Geo in the sense of geolocation, physio because there is an onboard camera, and mobile because it is a jacket that you wear. We also have electronic bracelets for the prisoners.
I'm really happy to have participated in this workshop, thanks to the different projects that were presented. I understood that even as a student, you can create solutions that can revolutionize the world. Here, I saw startups that have proposed unique solutions that cannot be found anywhere else in the world and that have won international awards.
The AFDB also used the platform to launch its fourth industrial revolution report on Africa. According to its findings, the fourth industrial revolution will, among other things, enable Africa to engage in precision farming with unmanned aerial vehicles. That, in turn, will improve food security and the supply chain while modernizing the agricultural sector. Brian Toussaint, CGTN.
Well, let's head back to our discussion on US-Ethiopia relations going forward. We managed to get back Mr. Gabriel Zemedene Negatu. He's the global chairman of Fairfax Africa Fund. Great to have you again with us, Mr. Negatu. Now, just before we went last time, you were talking about China's influence on the continent in Ethiopia. And of course, some saying that this US trip was more about countering China's dominance in the country than stepping up US engagement in Ethiopia. Do you agree with that notion?
Well, I mean, if you heard what Secretary Pompeo said during his visit to Ethiopia, and also in the two other countries he visited, Angola and Senegal, he mentioned China, sometimes explicitly, but sometimes in a subtle way, that he's saying the U.S. model is better than the other countries, he said, which obviously meant China. Now, the point, though, is the United States, yes, there's some major initiatives the Trump administration has rolled out, which is the Prosper Africa, backed by $60 billion with the Development Finance Corporation. But at the end of the day, what Africans are looking for, including here in Ethiopia, is substance, okay? Is the U.S. going to fund the infrastructure that Africa needs, the roads, the airports, the bridges, and those kinds of things? Is the United States willing to finance the human capital building that Africa needs, the institutions that Africa needs, which is what China has been doing? And so for Mr. Pompeo and President Trump to be heard in a very tangible way in Africa, they need to show that there is money on the table and other initiatives that shows Africans the U.S. engagement is real. And again, he was very explicit, as I said, sometimes not. So we need to take it in that context, so especially in Ethiopia, where the growth is very substantial, going forward in particular, a large country. China has been heavily engaged. If you look at the industrial parks built by the Chinese, a lot of the infrastructure by the... So I think Pompeo was saying we can engage. And to be fair to the Americans, they put in $9 billion via the IMF, the World Bank, and others. But I think an economy of this size with huge potentials going forward is going to need a bigger engagement by the United States. Granted, there are indications that the United States will put some very substantial resources. But my view is that Ethiopia, like other African countries, being courted by the two sides is actually healthy. I think taking from China what helps these countries, including Ethiopia, and taking from the Americans and the Europeans what would help their national interest. That should be the approach, not to tell the Africans, don't do deals with China. I don't think that's the way to approach this. But anyway, he was very explicit and sometimes implicit, saying, be careful about China. I think that was the theme of his message across Africa and the three countries he visited, especially here yesterday in Ethiopia.
Now, very quickly, there have been a lot of mixed signals when it comes to Trump's administration's engagement with Africa. Do you think that this visit has changed any of those perceptions in terms of cooperation with Ethiopia and the rest of the continent going forward?
To be honest with you, what would change perception and the mixed messages you indicated the U.S. is sending is substance. As I said, put money on the table, engage Africans in a meaningful way, and then Africans, the perception Africans, and also, I mean, I know this might seem like an easy thing to do or to suggest, but if President Trump, for example, came and visited a few African countries, that would show respect, that would show that the United States is, because I was just looking at some numbers. The Chinese Prime Minister, the first visit he does every year of the new year is in Africa. Pompeo and his predecessor have only visited Africa, 8 or 9 countries in almost 4 years. So I think those kinds of signals, that's respect for Africa by visiting, but also backed by meaningful action, as I said earlier, will change the perception of the United States is disengaged, which in some case it has. It is disengaged from Africa. China and Africa trade is over $200 billion. U.S.-Africa trade is about $70 billion. That by itself tells you that there's a big gap to be filled. And I think these visits, while they are welcome and it shows attention, needs to be backed by substance.
Well, as always, it's great to have your insights on the show, Mr. Negatu. That was Zemedene Negatu, of course, the global chairman of the Fairfax Africa Fund, joining us there in Addis Ababa. Well, let's move on now. The group of cabinet ministers responsible for fixing South Africa's crippling energy crisis has met for the first time since it was re-established by President Cyril Ramaphosa last December. At that time, the country was going through its worst bout of power rationing. Today, up to 2,000 megawatts of generation capacity is currently offline, and that excludes power plants which are offline because of a significant maintenance backlog. As CGTN's Angelo Coppola reports now, power shortages are still likely to intensify.
The Eskom CEO and COO are part of the team. while the Minister of Finance, we understand, did not attend the meeting, which was convened to establish its own terms of reference.
I think there's important work to be done. It does concern me that they're still talking about the terms of reference instead of getting down to actually getting down to the work of unlocking the blockages. But I'm hoping that through, out of these crises comes a catalyst for change.
The blockages are significant. But during a briefing on Wednesday, the Mineral Resources Minister announced that one blockage is being dealt with. The energy regulator has approved 75 applications from private companies wanting to generate energy for self-use. But there are other blockages.
Regulatory and policy barriers that are preventing customers from becoming part of the solution, that are preventing municipalities from becoming part of the solution, and are preventing the Section 34 notices by the Minister of Energy, which are there to basically authorize the new procurements that have been identified in the Integrated Resource Plan for electricity.
The War Room has a lot of work to do. We are entering winter in the next couple of months with an increased demand, and there are expectations that load shedding will remain in place for the next 12 to 18 months. Eskom has also announced an increase in maintenance.
Now, what this means in the short term, and by short I'm talking about in the next year ahead, is not reduced load shedding, it's increased load shedding. Because taking more generation capacity off the grid for deep level maintenance, so-called philosophy maintenance, means that less generation is available to meet demand.
Analysts are wondering if the War Room will share its decisions with consumers and experts. And that's because Eskom and government have failed to share the findings of at least 2 other technical task team reviews and investigations that have taken place in the past 12 months. Based on previous experience, business and private users of Eskom's power are likely to be kept in the dark in terms of the outcomes of this latest War Room meeting. I'm Angelo Coppola for CG10 in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now this week, Tunisia is hosting the 13th edition of the International Human Resources Development Exhibition. The international fair has attracted more than 2,500 visitors and experts from a range of countries in Africa and Europe. CGTN's Adnan Shaushi was there and filed this report.
The event aims to contribute to consolidating the function of human resources management in companies and offer recruitment opportunities.
This international fair serves companies and orients businesses in their human resources choices and strategies. The world of HR is changing. Therefore, private and public companies must adapt to the new needs in this sector.
The representatives and managers of several multinationals insisted on the importance of effective recruitment, selection and management in order to guarantee reliable and constant growth.
Our multinational company operates in over 70 countries. We speak more than 70 languages. We have over 150 international clients and more than 2,500 employees in Tunisia. We are here to learn about the latest human resource solutions.
African participants stressed the need for exchanging experience in the continent so as to improve the performance of companies by relying on technology.
I've shed some light on the HR experience in Mali and Sub-Saharan Africa in general with the Maghreb. The perceptions are different, but we can use the same programs to solve common problems.
Tunisia is not a small market, and our target is to invest massively in the whole Maghreb region, Algeria and Morocco. The idea is to support change management here in the HR environment.
An exhibition area was set up with the participation of more than 60 local and foreign companies. The HR Expo has attracted over 2,500 visitors. At least 50 qualified graduates and candidates were recruited at the job fair, which was held on the sidelines of this international event. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
You are watching Global Business Africa. We're heading into a quick break, still coming up on the show. The European Union is looking to make its mark in the tech and artificial intelligence sectors. And ASEAN member states wrap up emergency meetings on the coronavirus outbreak.
business in Africa is at the crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
Now, on the international front, the European Union has proposed a new digital strategy. The blueprint aims to challenge the US and China's dominance in tech and artificial intelligence. It will focus on a so-called digital single market that will support growth and innovation. From Brussels, here's CGTN's Lucy Howe.
Well, this is a really broad digital strategy from the European Union, long-awaited plans, both this set of new rules and regulations targeting specifically data and artificial intelligence, the way that European companies are able to handle European citizens' data here, but also a strategy moving forward, particularly the development of an EU single market for data to promote economic growth for European tech firms. As you say, this is about competing with the US and China and making the EU tech industry more competitive. But key to this is that this is done ethically and with this clear set of rules. Here's the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen speaking earlier in Brussels.
We want citizens to trust the new technology. And technology is always neutral. It depends on what we make with it. And therefore, we want the application of these new technologies to deserve the trust of our citizens. This is why we are promoting a responsible, human-centric approach to artificial intelligence.
Well, certainly Europe wants to be a serious contender in the global AI race, but it has been accused of falling way behind the US and China. These measures are both designed about boosting productivity and innovation in Europe, but also making Europe a world leader on the regulation of digital industries. And certainly Silicon Valley has sat up and listened to these. We have had high-profile visits from Google and Facebook. The Facebook CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, was in Brussels on Monday meeting with EU digital chiefs. He says that whilst he accepts that some good regulation is needed for technologies like artificial intelligence, too much would stifle innovation. Certainly too much regulation as far as businesses like his are concerned would have a major impact on their ability to access European markets.
Well, let's head to Laos now, where foreign ministers from China and 10 countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have wrapped up an emergency meeting on the coronavirus outbreak. Now, the 11 ministers agreed on joint measures to combat the threat of COVID-19 and prepare collectively for future outbreaks of the contagious disease. After China and Japan, the ASEAN countries have seen the highest number of confirmed cases of the virus. Our correspondent, Rian Melzer, is in the Lao capital, Vientiane, and filed this report.
Stay strong, Wuhan. Stay strong, Wuhan. Stay strong, China. Stay strong, China. Stay strong, ASEAN. Stay strong, ASEAN.
A show of solidarity among the 10 ASEAN countries and China in combating the new coronavirus, COVID-19. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi outlined for the ASEAN ministers the measures China has been taking and evidence that the worst may be over.
We have undertaken every possible measure, taken very serious action to bring the outbreak under control. We are very effectively controlling the virus's spread, and it shows that the preventative actions have worked to produce positive results.
ASEAN ministers outlined the impact of the outbreak on their region, as well as the measures they are taking to contain the virus's spread. A joint press conference reinforced the message that China and ASEAN are united in the fight against the coronavirus.
There will be some impact on our economies, but it will be temporary and limited. Through close cooperation between ASEAN and China, it will enable us to overcome and quickly make up for the economic impact.
We have jointly and comprehensively reviewed our joint effort and commitment and charter future direction. We have also shared with each other the best practices, lessons learned, and effective methods in surveillance, detecting, and researches.
They also proposed longer-term measures to make sure China and ASEAN are better prepared for outbreaks of other communicable diseases, like improving communication between frontline agencies and jointly ensuring adequate supplies of vital medical goods for the future. Ryan Meltzer, CGTN, Vientiane.
Now, one of America's retail icons is downsizing in light of a retail winter that has, of course, seen numerous famous names wither in the face of stiff competition from online shopping websites. How did it all go so wrong for Macy's? Here's CGTN's John Terrett exploring.
Whenever I think of Macy's, I think of three things. Number one, Miracle on 34th Street, the Hollywood Christmas movie that is set here and is a real family favorite. Number two is the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, which happens every November right here at the junction of Broadway and 34th Street, where Macy's is headquartered. And the third thing is the store itself. It is a real New York landmark. It is one of the biggest single stores in the world, with 2 million square feet over 10 floors. But just to show you how big this complex is, follow me now from Broadway all the way down to 7th Avenue, which is the other side of this vast building. I'm heading west along the famous 34th Street. Macy's windows, famous the world over for the amount of effort that goes into making these as beautiful as possible. This one's for Valentine's Day. I'm picking my way through the crowds, enjoying New York's mild winter. And here we are on 7th Avenue. As New Yorkers say, Macy's is the store that takes up a whole city block. But Macy's is in trouble. Stiff competition from the internet has damaged this giant store and its many branches all over the country. As if to emphasize the point, I found this book on our bookshelf in the newsroom. It's about department stores. There's a picture of Macy's. And the author writes, nothing charts the rise of organized retail quite like the department store, where innovators and empire builders have created magnificent bazaars and emporiums in cities from New York to Paris. It's all well and good. But what went wrong at Macy's? Alan Adamson has a pretty good idea. He says Macy's put off taking the really tough decisions for far too long.
By the time they realize it's time to change, sales are dropping, they're bleeding money, and all they can do is cut expenses. They can't innovate and reinvent themselves.
Macy's gets it now, though. It's recently announced 125 stores, that's 1/5 of all of them around the country, will close. 2,000 jobs are to be axed, and the corporate headquarters in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the Midwest, shuttered. The CEO says the changes we're making are deep and impact every area of the business, but they are necessary. I know we will come out of this transition stronger, more agile, and better fit to compete in today's retail environment. Of course, Macy's is not alone in this. Rival department stores are going through tough times as well.
It's a big challenge for brick and mortar business because they have buildings and real estate, and you can't double click and eliminate that. You own that. And so often when they innovate, they have to say, well, how do we reimagine this big store when the big store may not be the right place to start?
Macy's is really two businesses, the inventory it keeps in stores and the customer experience. It's tough to attract the best people to work in an ailing business. One way forward may be the Bonomo's model, where customers try on clothes in the store to get the right colour and fit, but the garment arrives in the mail the next day.
A smaller experience that's not inventory related, that might be a way future, but it certainly will not be the same store, just fewer of them.
In other words, a miracle on 34th Street, please. And we're not talking about the movie this time. John Terrett, CGTN, New York.
Well, let's move on now to commodities. Here's a look at how some of them performed today. Gold prices edging lower today. That's after China announced more measures to limit the economic effect from the coronavirus epidemic. But a rise in the number of new cases in South Korea did keep bullion close to a near 7-year peak today. Brent oil prices holding near 1-month highs, supported by supply concerns in Venezuela and Libya. But of course, China's move to cut its benchmark lending rate also helped ease some of those worries about slowing demand in the world's largest crude oil importer. Well, let's take a short break now. Still to come. We'll tell you why Sudan bakeries are heavily guarded in Khartoum. And a Tunisian artist gives non-biodegradable scraps a new life.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN. See the difference.
Now, as an economic crisis in Sudan continues, volunteers have been deployed at bakeries in order to crack down on the diversion of taxpayer-subsidized flour to the black market. Here's CGTN's Daniel Arap-Moy exploring how these volunteers are ensuring everything runs smoothly on grassroots tonight.
As bakers in flour-stained clothes knead dough and slide trays of loaves into ovens in Sudan's capital, a cluster of yellow-vested volunteers keep watch. The goal here to stem the smuggling of heavily subsidized flour and bread destined for citizens struggling through a long-running economic crisis.
Our role as Resistance Committee deployed at bakeries is about oversight. We are monitoring what enters and leaves the bakery. The flour before it is made into bread, the bread that comes out, who it goes to, and what time and why.
For years, resentment had mounted in Sudan over a worsening economic crisis, but an attempt to raise bread prices changed the course of the country's history. In 2018, demonstrations broke out in the central town of Atbara and quickly morphed into a nationwide movement against longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir. Bashir's government had long subsidized fuel, bread and several other staples. But this was a heavy burden on public finances in a country hit by US sanctions and the loss of oil revenues since South Sudan gained its independence.
My personal view is that if the government removed the subsidy, it would still be better than the old regime coming back, because I am sure that moving forward, it will only get better. Sudan will be better.
The volunteers who work in shifts are drawn from a so-called resistance committees. The groups are connected to the movement that mobilized months of street protest before and after Bashir was forced from power last April. The volunteers are present round the clock at bakeries across Khartoum and beyond to ensure that everything runs smoothly.
Bread is a symbol of the revolution. The revolution began in Atbara over a loaf of bread. And our brothers in Atbara rose up because of a loaf of bread. And from there, our revolution was born.
For the past 2 weeks, Mohamed Babeka and his fellow volunteers have been entering their data on floor deliveries, bakery closures and smuggling into a mobile app.
This application allows for the resistance committees to log reports on bakeries receiving raw materials, bakeries that are closed, and reports on smuggling. All these reports go into one central database from all over Sudan. When the data is made available in one location, the right decisions can then be made to understand the problem.
Sudan, a country of about 40 million people, is a major wheat importer. It ships in about 2.5 million tons annually, despite its own domestic production of about 700,000 tons. But a $3 billion aid package offered by oil-rich Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates is expected to help tackle wheat crisis in the near to medium term. Daniel Arab Moy, CGTN.
Well, let's switch gears now. Typically, when screws, chains and wires have outlived their use, we usually discard them. Now, these materials are hard to dispose of as they are non-biodegradable. However, in Tunisia, a blacksmith is creating elaborate sculptures and other works of art by welding together these discarded remnants. Here's CGTN's Alexandria Majala with his story.
Tunisian blacksmith Mohamed Shraiti has been welding steel pieces to create elaborate works of art for nearly 4 decades now. His business has turned him into the king of steel art in the northeastern city of Nabil.
I use these pieces discarded by mechanics that cannot be reused like car and motorcycle engines. I clean them and turn them into extraordinary artwork. I create animal installations, human heads, frames, and sometimes we use them as tools to use in my artwork.
The 53-year-old blacksmith started working in his father's workshop when he was only 13. His growing passion pushed him to create large sculptures, furniture, and house accessories. Shraiti uses metal pieces discarded by mechanics who are usually happy to give them out for free. His clients also bring him their old cars and bikes to create more art.
I have clients who come to me because they love my artwork and understand that it's an extraordinary work of art. I put my work in their gardens or living rooms. I also make gifts for tourists who would like to buy small pieces that are 2 kilograms maximum so that they can carry them in their bags. You see these big ones? We make them small. I do the order with the shape they want.
I always buy Mohammed's artwork. Sometimes I get something he created, and sometimes I ask him to create some certain things. He's an artist, and I call him the crazy artist because he's very good and makes interesting stuff.
The artisan first cleans the scrap metal before welding them together to create his pieces. He then gives them a final colorful splash. The prices of his pieces range between $35,000 to $5,000 depending on the size. His artwork has fans even outside Tunisia, as his fame extends well beyond his small town, with customers from Germany, France, Italy and Belgium coming to his workshop to buy gifts. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Well, before we go, let's check in on Africa's currencies today. Today saw currencies in the developing world reeling under the pressure from safe haven buying of the US dollar today. The dollar has surged nearly 2% since Tuesday against the Japanese yen to its highest in almost 10 months. Now, most emerging market currencies were pushed lower by the rising greenback. South Africa's rand was weaker on that note. It also took a hit from growing pessimism around the country's economy, while of course local investors remain on edge ahead of a looming ratings decision by Moody's, which is coming up. More on that tomorrow. But for now, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.